nii, ja alustame oma.
Let's begin with the last panel discussion of the day. Is the internet a human right? And I'm extremely happy that the introduction will be provided by Minna-Liina from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Undersecretary for Global Affairs.
Nii, head pärastlõunat kõigile.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I don't know where to look, so I'll try to look everywhere. I'm extremely happy that the Freedom of the Internet panel is taking place and I'm introducing it. And to begin with, I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers. I know from experience how difficult it is to organize such events, and I am very happy about the focus topics that we have here today. And of course, the issues we'll be touching on are also related to this. So Estonia has been a pathfinder regarding this topic, and this is why we are discussing it here today, why technology and how technology and human rights intersect. Estonian experience has served as a role model to many, but we also need to think about how to retain digital freedoms in a quickly changing world. The internet has changed our organization of life, how we work, how we communicate, and it has brought people closer to each other, allowed access to information, and provided many people the opportunity to make their voices heard. But internet freedom is much more than just technological advancement. It's the foundation of rights and obligations. The right to free self-expression, access to information, and participation in the digital world without censorship or being monitored. So the internet is no longer just a tool. It has become a cornerstone of fundamental rights. The possibility to receive information to organize online is integral to privacy, assembly, freedom of speech, but we see that these freedoms are under constant pressure. Across the globe, we see censorship and increase of supervision. Authoritarian regimes are taking more control of the internet, and for the 14th year, freedom online has declined. Hate speech, cybercrime, fake news, and terrorism laws are used by many countries to restrict freedom of speech. And aggressive neighbor to Estonia, Russia, according to UN, has blocked more than 1.7 million web pages. And we have many examples from other regions of the world as well. And we need to consider that when shutting down or restricting access to internet can threaten human lives, for example, in the context of the functioning of hospitals. At the same time, more power with technology companies and their control over the spread of information raises serious questions about privacy, autonomy, and freedom of expression. And the free and cooperation-based internet of the past is at risk. In Estonia, where digital innovation is a source of national pride, these questions are very important. Integration of technology into governance has made Estonia a pathfinder, but even here there is a central issue: how to guarantee that we retain freedom of internet, how to continue with digital innovation at the same time, making sure that we adhere to human rights. And internet freedom is not only technological or infrastructure issue, it is primarily a human rights issue. Everybody, independent of their conviction, language, background, or location, must have the right to express their thoughts freely and have access to information without fear of oppressions. It also means ensuring privacy, that people should not be afraid of monitoring, surveillance, or abuse of their personal data. Ensuring these freedoms cannot be selective. These are the pillars of democracy and a just society. protecting internet freedom is not the responsibility of a single country, it is a global issue. Since censorship and surveillance are more widespread, it is extremely important that the international community works together to protect freedom of speech, privacy, and access to information. Estonia has shown that it is possible to build a safe, innovative, transparent digital society where human rights and fundamental rights are respected. Estonia has integrated digital literacy, cybersecurity, and legal remedies to establish an open and safe cyberspace. And for the aforementioned reason, this year, Estonia again is the chair of the Coalition of Internet Freedom. Estonia was the chair also in 2014 for the first time. We also had complicated times then in the world, but I think everybody here agrees that currently the situation in the world is much worse. And for this reason, Estonia has great responsibility in leading a coalition of 42 members, also considering Estonia's high position in the Internet Freedom global list. And during our presidency, we focus on two primary priorities: for the coalition to actively participate in international internet management processes this year, and considering the complicated dynamics of the world is very important, and introducing Estonian e-governance solutions and finding global implementation possibilities to reduce the digital divide. And there are many examples of it, but I would like to highlight the Democratic Republic of Congo, where only 1% of households have access to the internet, and only 27% of the population use the internet. And until July 2025, together with Germany, Estonia is a co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition, which is important considering that a lot of the media is online and internet freedom is extremely important in the work of journalists. So these are two of the coalition activities that meet. Today, I call on you to discuss the kind of future we want for the internet. Do we want a future where the same freedoms that we find important outside the web would still be valid online? Thank you, and I wish you a successful panel.
Ja mul on au kutsuda.
And I have the honor to invite here the members of the panel. ZUHRA HALIMOVA from Tajikistan. Patricia Shaw, the UK. HILLE HINSBERG from Estonia, I'm sure you know her. KOMAITIS, Switzerland. And the moderator will be MAARJA, the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Aga MAARJA, mul on sulle...
MAARJA, I have a few questions for you as well. Is social media a human right? It's a very good question because it depends on if we define human rights as something which has been written down in a declaration, or shall we define it as every person will say themselves what is human right for them? Can you advise me? Facebook or Meta communicating with us, have they shut down our Facebook page? We have not been able to access it. We've been talking to them half a year. They say, fix the page. We can open it. So we ask, what have we done wrong? So we've been sending letters to each other for half a year. Are they online, the letters? Yes, there's a very specific person who is answering them. But let us continue.
So, everyone, thank you for making your way here to Estonia. And so when I was asked to moderate the panel, I thought about how to introduce this topic. We're going to be talking about internet freedom for the next one and a half hours. And so I thought I would actually tell you about the relationship between humans and technology based on my own experience. And hopefully that will illustrate the topic of the panel. So what I've come to what I've come to realize is that every generation really has a vastly different experience. So looking at my parents' generation, who are in their mid-60s now, they are daily internet users. They use it skillfully. And for the non-Estonians in the room, you know we do everything online, right? So taxes takes us 2 minutes. So yeah, if there's any Americans, I know you'll be very jealous of that. But nonetheless, I still feel that it somehow is still something foreign to them. Even though they use it daily and they do it well, it's somehow still something foreign, something distinct from them. Me, on the other hand, I was about 5 years old when I first saw a laptop. It was my dad's work computer that he brought home. And the best moments were when me and my brother were allowed to play this one game that we had on a floppy disk. And anyone younger than me will not know what a floppy disk is. If you don't, you're lucky. What I remember vividly, however, was the surprise on my dad's face when in just a few minutes I could almost instinctively do things on the computer that took him hours to learn. And if any of that has made you feel old, don't worry, you're not alone. I myself, I'm starting to realize that I'm becoming a part of the older generation. And this happened when I saw a teenager scrolling TikTok on the bus. And if you've ever seen if you've ever seen them do it, it's like this. You know, within half a second, they are able to assess whether something is interesting to them or not. And it's shocking to me how seamlessly they seem to do it. So this in turn made me think about what the generation after them will look like. And it seems that the way that we relate to technology changes to its core with every generation. Each generation seems to be more fused with technology than the one before them. So it's really not difficult to imagine that at one point, the line between humans and technology will become obfuscated. And here I actually, I would like to make the premise of internet as information, as this is what internet is essentially about, right? It's really a mass of information. So when we then consider this fusion, we realize that it will be a fusion of humans with endless information. I'll let that sit with you for a second. And so what does all of this have to do with internet freedom? I think the question before us is, knowing this fusion is coming, what does it mean for us? How can we prepare to make sure that we will actually be fused with the best version of the internet? So luckily we have this great panelists here today to figure this all out. And let's turn to the opening statements. And if possible, I would like each of you to, in your opening statements, include, to paint a picture of what we kind of expected the internet to look like at one point, what it could be in an ideal world. But also please describe the situation that we are in now. What is the internet actually like? How different is it from the vision that we once had for the internet? Yeah, I will turn to Hille.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this opportunity. If we can pull the couple of slides that we have prepared, this will, I hope, take you to really painting the picture what is we're talking about when we talk about freedom online. We will also talk about what's not freedom, or what's the sort of anti-thing that we find in our digital living room. Because this, when you look at the map, yes, you can see the world. But in terms of our digital lives, you're also looking at our living rooms, bedrooms, or working spaces. Because this is how entangled and how mixed our lives already are in this cyberspace or internet as we know it. What you're seeing now is a glimpse of the current state of affairs that Freedom House is depicting. And as Minna-Liina said, yes, the news is not that rosy. The freedoms online have been steadily in decline for the 14th year in a row. I think you recognize the color codes. The green ones are deemed to be still free, have all the relevant safeguards in place. None of the countries is perfect. But the yellow ones are experiencing some troubles, and then the purple ones are way, way behind and becoming a sort of coalition, in inverted commas, for the non-freedoms, or having the worst online space. And just to name names, of course, China, Myanmar, the authoritarian regimes are sort of on the list from starting with the 72 countries, the least free. Kyrgyzstan has joined them recently. And as for the kind of pioneers or those who are doing well, then yes, I'm very happy to report, having been the rapporteur for Estonia, that for 5 years us and Iceland have sort of shared the top positions. Well, for example, Canada is not far behind. This is not a race to the top. This is an indicator on what kind of critical, I would say, domains or categories are actually assessed. And when we pull the next slide, the categories that are actually scrutinized are 3 of them. One is, I would say, even poorly technical. It's just mere access, whether the governments, the countries, of course, the technology companies, the internet service providers are making steps to ensure the sort of equal access, inclusive access, connectivity to get online and to lead our lives online. The second pillar is content. And access to content, whether it's manipulated, whether it's censored, and yes, the news in that category are really bad and is getting worse. And then the third one is actually protection of user rights. So there we come as close as possible to the human rights. Of course, Freedom House and Freedom on the Net is rooted. The index and the methodology is rooted in taking a look at the basic civic and human rights. So yes, I can switch on. I just remembered that I have the tool for it. So this might be a little too small a script for you, but I think the visual depicts all the 72 countries that the report covers. And then when you see the right-hand side, what are the sort of indicators, and then what countries are either above the threshold or below the threshold. So I will not go very, very much commenting on each and every kind of indicator, but just bringing you some trends that would be perhaps eloquent for today's discussion as well. So first of all, I'm really sorry to be the messenger, but the report covers approximately close to 90% of all internet users. And when the data says that 3/4 of internet users are actually facing arrest for non-violent expression, at times leading to punishment close to 10 years, just for making your views known in the digital space. In 43 countries, people have been reported to physically attacked or killed in retaliation for their online activities. The internet shutdowns, remember the first pillar, just mere access to the digital world, are more and more evident. Of course, these are mainstream in authoritarian regimes like Belarus, like Myanmar, but other more subtle restrictions are also in place in other countries. In terms of past elections, and we had the election year, we have referred to it, more than half of the countries who underwent any kind of elections, there was clear evidence on tampering, not with the elections themselves, but the information surrounding elections. And this also means that the power that you started with, the power of social media, and in any kind of platforms, there is a wide opportunity, of course, the generative AI as well, to manipulate, coerce, and just influence the content so that people's views, candidates' views, become so muddled that we cannot, as citizens, make head or tail who is real, who is avatar, who is saying what, and how to counter this information. And that is certainly not soft power. It is very, very strictly influencing the democratic processes. Because with the most sham elections, for example, in Russia, people cannot even distinguish what is the electoral procedure. And that is very serious indeed. So with a limit to content, I would like to point out a couple of things, maybe being a digital transformation consultant and moving in the circles of developers and architects and engineers. Then techies want to go out there and grab all the data that they would need for some kind of purposes. But the two tech giants have severely limited this activity. The examples being, of course, Meta, who took down the tool that they actually had providing online and on-time access to their data, so they took it down, they put something else instead, but it's not satisfactory. Another way is to create a huge paywall, so let's say the white hat hackers and just civic activists cannot get to the information. X, the platform, made exactly that, disabling all the scraping. Those who go into that sort of activities, this might be the only way to actually get to the information that they need. And not wanting to end up this opening speech with only gloomy things, there are remedies and there are recipes. And you can see that for building trust online, at least Freedom House has made recommendations to stakeholders in the government, in the agencies, and in tech companies. So there are ways to actually slowly try to remedy the situation. There might be hard laws. Again, as an example, European Commission with the Digital Services Act has invoked this in order to curb the manipulation in social media platforms. And then the other recommendations I think we can turn back to and quote what can be done. But the main thing, I think we will talk about stakeholders who might have any kind of power to change the gloomy situation. So no, we are not talking only about regulations and only about government intervening, which might also have very controversial impact on the freedoms online, but also how can tech companies and of course the civic activists and volunteers make their best. And with this I will pass it on just with a small remark that if any of these stakeholders are left alone to battle, then there cannot be a good effect on it. So if governments expect volunteers or civic activists to go into digital literacy, fact-checking, and holding the tech companies and governments accountable, they probably cannot do it alone.
Thank you, Hille. You really painted a good picture of the situation we're in right now, and you mentioned also several topics that we will certainly come back to, regarding stakeholders, regarding information tampering. But I will now would like to turn to Trish Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So before I bring about my intervention, I just want to ask the audience a question just to make sure you're awake, quite frankly. How many of you already use ChatGPT, BERT, Claude, Gemini, ZUHRA, your character AI that you've chosen of your choice, or Stability AI, just to give it a multimodal? Put your hands up, please.
DeepSeek.
I haven't said DeepSeek. Thank you. Right, it's good to know. You may be asking, why am I asking this question when we're about to talk about the internet? Well, you will find out. So I'm going to open with some stats, if that's so, or a stat. So according to a new report from Europol, experts estimate that as much of 90% of online content may be synthetically generated by 2026. That's not far away. And that's media generated or manipulated using artificial intelligence, and most often generative AI. And obviously, just as we have a choice what platform we want to use for generative AI and use in our daily lives, the operators of the internet platforms, the social media platforms, the tech providers have a choice as to the kinds of AI tool from their toolbox that they want to use to further their aims of their business model, including using data often from its greatest commodity, us, or its second greatest commodity, the World Wide Web. Whether it's a business model of data extraction, permitting only those that can afford it not to be harvested for their data, producing a privacy premium, or for those that can't be subjected to privacy impoverishment, and invoking then a problem for our own privacy, or whether it's a business model that thrives on predictive analytics and inference that feeds you just the right amount of content at just the exact time for you to proceed with that purchase or click through a link, benefiting from economies of action, in Shoshana Zuboff's words, or brain hacking, in Tristan Harris's words. This results in a user, a consumer, a worker, a citizen, an individual like you and me, a human being fundamentally, having been subtly coerced, manipulated, had their agency and autonomy over their choices just in that moment interfered with. So my first thought I want to leave you with is power sits with the AI providers in how they design their values into their tools, which businesses proceed, and multiple businesses proceed, to use as be based on their business models that will drive their economic prosperity and not human flourishing or societal well-being. And we've all heard the phrase that information is power. But what if that content is not real information at all? If it's informative content that's been generated algorithmically through an intermediary such as a Gen AI? What if Gen AI tools that we use are themselves not trained on real information, but synthetic data, maybe that 90% of the World Wide Web that it's about to become? Data that itself has been algorithmically generated. This can lead to something known as model collapse, which, despite safeguards and rules having been put in place in the initial phase, the model goes rogue, doesn't align with its original intended purpose, and may spew out information or informative content that is not quite as originally planned. And what that looks like for you and I may well be quite abrupt. It might be misogyny, it might be racial slurs, it might be offensive, vulgar material. This may all fall into the bucket of freedom of expression or speech in other parts of the world, without consideration for the impact to others and other human rights. But it may also create informative content which is subtle and even more intentionally deceptive in nature, engendering a slow and subversive opinion shift. So my second thought I want to leave you with, opinion shift, in the first instance, does impact on freedom of expression. It interferes with our formation of opinion, which we then proceed to hold as our own opinion, before then going on to further express it, disseminate it, as if it were the opinion we were to hold to. This impacts not just on freedom of expression, but depending on newly formed algorithmically mediated opinion, potentially it then impacts on multiple other human rights, such as our autonomy and freedom of conscience, including political and religious beliefs, and equality, as opinions are no longer held without algorithmic interference. At the tech layer of the generative stack, and there's this like funnel effect, so I won't go into too much detail, organizations, tech providers put in these so-called guardrails. These are codified selections of what is or is not deemed acceptable for being algorithmically generated for view. And this brings about a hyper-personalised level of response for an audience of one. And a recent example of this you may have heard of and seen in the press, where ChatGPT and Claude and DeepSeek were asked to give a response to the Tiananmen Square atrocity, where the other two came back with relatively reasonable, maybe historically a little bit dodgy content. DeepSeek came back with this, a response that simply stated, sorry, that's beyond my scope. Let's talk about something else. This causes an echo chamber for hyper-personal opinion formation. On the one hand, this kind of tech intervention might seem like it's safeguarding the impacts of informative content, but with a genuine understanding of the human rights implications for interfering with the outputs of generative AI prompted questions, this could be deemed an unjustified interference with our expression. We therefore have an even more concentrated element of power in our information or informative content ecosystem. An opinion shift which controls the answers to our questions, and to paraphrase George Orwell, whoever controls the algorithmically mediated answers controls reality. So thought number 3 I want to leave you with is, for this reason, we need to be talking about information pluralism, information integrity, and by virtue of preserving pluralism and keeping information integrity free of algorithmic mediation, we then also need to be talking and discussing about information security to preserve our freedom of expression and thus our freedom of thought. It is the duty of governments to promote freedom of expression, not through a Wild West approach to splurging without responsibility or giving greater value to those opinions which rise to the top of the search engine, platform, roll or scroll, but through preserving and securing the creation of, access to, digestion of credible, verifiable, authenticated real information through information plurality. So my thought 4 that I want to leave you with is, without genuine freedom of expression, we risk undermining democracy, perhaps at the expense of GDP and economic growth, which also sacrifices the rule of law, which we've been seeing in the last couple of days. Without information pluralism, integrity and security, we engender the second-order and third-order effects to our democracy, undermining our rule of law, both of which are fragile and need to be preserved. We are only as strong as the day before these protections are gone. This, for me, is an existential crisis, one in which the internet and the power tools of AI used on it will play out a very dystopian period until we find a transnational, collaborative, cooperative way forward to govern AI and tools like Gen AI, and increasingly the use of agentic AI. I won't go there just for now. The internet is a utility, and it's as vital to many organisations, to many people, to many governments, as it is electricity and gas. Yet the internet is not currently owned, apparently, by anyone. We do not yet consider its collective pages worthy of digital commons, although we're trying to get there with the Global Digital Compact, and of affordances with protection for the promotion of human rights. However, human rights altering AI power tools are permitted to be used amongst its pages, relatively unchecked. But there is an elephant in the room here, the power asymmetry between the creators of generative AI and those that wield them. Gen AI is, in all its various multimodal forms, is a power tool, designed and developed by a few to be wielded often without responsibility for the ultimate context and the audience for its application and consumption. Furthermore, attempts to so-called protect human rights through this unjustified interference because of coded rules and safeguards in the tool don't work. So my thought number 5 I want to leave you with is, this concentration of power demonstrates not just an opinion shift, but an important power shift from so-called legitimated institutions who govern and steward the rule of law and fundamental rights, to economically driven bodies, companies, tech providers, created out of a legal construct often, given legitimacy by its shareholders, that can run roughshod over the rule of law without the rule of law making institutions knowing or even understanding what these power tools are doing. So my close to you is, when are we going to stop considering these new technologies out of context and realise they're more than play toys and playthings? They are power tools, and dare I say, the power tools, in need of safety instructions, in need of better participatory human rights-centred governance to safeguard and promote human rights. And so, in answer to the earlier question, to create a flourishing and enabling environment for both the creation of information, the challenge of information, the access to information, ultimately the formation of opinion before entrenched opinions are formed and held, I believe that we need to hold technological power to account, so it needs to be transparent and accountable. But this calls for multinational, multilateral and multi-stakeholder approaches to keep that power in check. And we've heard about the role that various institutions like the UN, the Council of Europe and the OSCE play in that. So this requires a funded, and dare I say from earlier's talk, loud civil society and academia, and an empowered and well-informed citizenry that stands up for human rights, justice and dignity for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. It sounds like, Hille, you don't need to worry about having made the gloomiest statement. I think Trish just outdid you.
Turned it a notch even higher.
Did warn you.
So let's now turn to Konstantinos, please.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. First of all, let me just say how pleased I am to be back in Tallinn. This is my second time, and I will keep coming back if you ask me to. And also, that whoever organized this panel is brilliant, because I don't get to be in panels where predominantly are women, and I love the fact that I am the only man here. So, and with that, I am going to take you a little bit back. I'm going to take you back to the basics, basically, and talk a little bit about the internet, talk a little bit about what is this thing that we keep referring to, and everyone is throwing the word internet left, right, and center, but if you actually start pressing people, what do they mean? They will give you a variety of different answers. I will start by saying what it's not. The internet is not Facebook, it is not Google, it is not Amazon, it is not TikTok, it is not X, and it is certainly not ChatGPT. These are services that are running on top of the internet infrastructure. They're running on the World Wide Web. And actually, the internet can't survive without the World Wide Web. It can survive without Google. It can survive without Facebook, because it is actually those services that need the infrastructure in order to have the global presence that they have, in order to be scalable, and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture of the internet. The internet, like many, many other technologies, is based on some fundamental properties. Accessibility, openness, the global reach, interoperability. But the fundamental thing about the internet is the fact that it is a decentralized architecture. It is a decentralized and distributed. And that's where the power lies, because what this means effectively is that the internet has no center of control. There is not a single point of failure. Trish said that no one controls the internet. That's pretty true, and thank God that no one does it. However, a lot of people out there, and very recently governments, are trying to do exactly just that. They're trying to figure out a way to be able and control the way packets, which is effectively what the internet is all about, move from point A to point B. The thing about the internet's architecture, which is genius, is the fact that it doesn't really care about what it carries. It has a very specific mission. Its mission is to take the packets of data, whatever that is, content, video, voice, you name it, and move it from one computer to the other. This is very much unlike the telephone system, right? The telephone system, basically, when it's moving packets of data from point A to point B, it really has one path that it can follow. If that path has an obstacle, the telephone drops, and then it goes back, and you have to do it all over again. In the internet, the packet always reaches its destination, and that is extremely powerful. The second powerful thing about a decentralized technology like the internet is that you have a lot of networks. That's why we're referring to the internet as the network of networks. But each network is autonomous and independent to make its own decisions and policies. The only requirement to participate in the network of networks is that you speak a common language. And that is the IP protocol that was created back in the 70s by a bunch of engineers that wanted exactly to facilitate that, the ability to have communications even in times of natural or non-natural distractions. So, in a way, the internet is actually a profoundly human technology because there is something profoundly human with the ability to be able and have self-autonomy and self-determination, yet be part of the whole. I am Greek, as you might have guessed, so I occasionally go back to Aristotle and I say that if he were alive right now, he would actually declare that the internet is a social animal because it can really not live without the other networks. The more the networks, the stronger and the more resilient the internet is. So, as you can imagine, this architecture is a nightmare for authoritarian governments because they cannot control it. What we're seeing compared to how the internet started right now is that there is a very active effort from especially Russia and China, to try and manipulate this architecture and control the internet both domestically and internationally. They're doing this at different levels and at different sophistication. Currently, China is the only country in the world that has managed to create an extremely sophisticated internet model that is able to fully control internally. Russia has tried to do it. I'm sure that you might remember back in 2019, there was these huge declarations that we are going to disconnect ourselves from the internet. Here we are in 2025, and they haven't done that simply because they cannot do it. The internet is full of interdependencies, and if you really want to create your own version of the internet, you really need to start like China did back in the day and start building a domestic market, a domestic technology culture that is able to create the great firewall that they have, and so on and so forth. And also, if you really want a domestic market, you really need to be able to scale it. And unlike China, that has 1+ billion people, Russia doesn't have that. So even if they wanted to disconnect, there wouldn't be an economy that would be able to support purely on the internet. Internationally, however, is where things get very tricky and quite dangerous. We have moved now, over the past few years, into a multipolar world. We are seeing what is happening. The geopolitical shifts are great. We are seeing what is happening with the United States. And China's role within especially the United Nations has been increasing, as well as its influence. Someone mentioned in the previous panel the Pact for the Future, which I'm sure no one has heard of. But adjacent to that, there was a huge negotiation that took place for 2 years called the Global Digital Compact. And the Secretary General of the United Nations asked the member states to come together and try to figure out how to agree and collaborate for our digital future. For the first time there, we actually saw a China that came extremely aggressive. They came with a very specific internet model that they were able to promote, and that model is getting traction. Make no mistake, that model is not the internet. It is top-down, it is centralized, it is based on surveillance, it is based on top-down control, and it does not allow innovation or anything of the things that we have seen. Now, I am painting a very, very good picture of the internet, but there are also some really bad things happening there, right? I mean, we have those companies that I have mentioned, that they're using the internet infrastructure to their advantage to do some pretty nasty things, and there are legitimate concerns from governments around the world about how to tackle those things. But these things are not the internet. You can really still tackle those things. You can tackle disinformation, you can tackle hate speech, you can tackle issues of competition without really touching the internet and staying true to its architecture. So I will leave you with that again, in both previous panels mentioned this shift between the G7 and the BRICS and the dynamics, how they play out. If you look at currently the G7 countries, 5 out of 7 are going through a political turmoil. When you look at the BRICS, the differences are really great. They're great between them. However, one of the things that they seem to be very much in sync is when it comes to their view on the internet and digital governance. This idea that the state needs to have the ultimate control on how information and communication is determined, and they share that similar vision. They share the vision that non-state actors should not have an active role, and they also share a vision that human rights and civil society that is there to advocate for those human rights should not be part of the conversation. And they're actively trying to do that. So the past couple of weeks have been extremely difficult for civil society organizations. The USAID and the freeze of foreign assets is crippling, really, internet freedom and organizations across the world that are trying to advocate for internet freedom, and a lot of democratic states have depended on them in order to be able and actually advocate for those human rights in a medium that was literally created to support human rights. So I will leave you going back to your original ask. Yes, when the internet was created, it was full of promise. And we saw that. We saw the empowerment of citizens. We saw the democratization of information. We saw the ability of people to hook their devices online and be educated, get out of poverty. We actually saw even in daily life, farmers being able to communicate in ways they were not able to communicate prior to the internet. And that was also, and do so in a very cheap way. Right now, this is really not happening. We are moving into a very dystopian, which is really much as the conversations that we're having today, vision of the internet. We're moving to a place where the internet is seen as a very dark place, and we're moving to a place where a very small number of white male tech bros are using the internet in order to be able and do no good, not to empower citizens, but instead creating a cesspool of hate and disinformation and division across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantinos. You raised some very interesting points. I hope we have time to come back to, you mentioned the kind of internet and geopolitics domain, which is especially interesting. I hope we have time to come back to that later. But I will now like to turn to you, ZUHRA, please.
Yes, I would like to thank my colleagues. They actually made my life very easy to move forward. I'm not going to stop in any of these issues. I will actually go down to earth. It's about us, consumers of internet, and any digital services provided through internet and by internet. And it's evolutionizing so fast that sometimes you actually think, what would be next tomorrow and what I have to learn? And I'm glad you mentioned about this ageism, you know, how the different ages adopting to use of digital devices and internet. But it's not only this particular dimension we have to remember when we're talking about internet and rights and access and freedoms and etc. Geopolitics are very important. However, geographies are also important. Depends where you live, you will have access or no access to internet. You have good internet or very slow internet. Depends where you live in the city or in a village. Will make a very, very, very different life of you with internet, without internet, with some internet. It depends only if you're a woman or young man or man. It's also makes a very, very big difference where you have access to internet. You can actually use it for the purposes of eliminating poverty or living better, having access to education. It's all about different types of new discrimination, whether you have access to internet or not, but it's also if you have a device. if you have access to a simple mobile phone nowadays. You don't have to have a computer anymore. But at least if you have a smartphone, you have an internet and you can be connected. So when we were coming together and thinking, what is actually happening with this, like a consumer of internet, just a simple citizen? What is happening in their life? It's not only about what they have access, but what they give back as a result. And this is actually one of the researches which was done on the methodology of ranking digital rights. We looked through businesses, fintechs, internet providers, mobile communication providers, and e-commerce platforms, how they interact with their consumers of their services. And I will have the same question as Trish did, but from the other angle, not AI. Can you please raise your hand if you ever read all the documents while signing in to any of the mobile internet provided services? Did you read the contract fully before you agree? Okay, 1. 2.
I think they're lawyers. They're probably lawyers.
Yeah, I did have a go.
Did you, before you agreeing, did you actually read the cookie policies?
I did. I do.
Did you disagree with the policies while actually wanting to be connected to that services?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. So what I'm trying to say, and I will tell you the same thing, I asked the same question at the Almaty University of Management, when the professors were sitting and students and guests and ambassadors. And there was only one person who actually from 300 people, hold his hand up. So the question comes to a point that even though the company will provide you with all these documents, usually on their website, you can always find them in majority of the cases, even in our countries. I bet in Estonia it's must, in Europe it's must. Most of the people do not even bother to read what they are agreeing with. And there was a research by Norton Group in UK, which was clearly saying that majority of the population trusts businesses and internet, not the governments. So while you are reading the contract, you're agreeing with certain things, and especially when it comes to your data and privacy, where your data goes. Especially when you agree that it goes to the third parties by default. And when you agree and you don't know who these third parties are, your data is going there. All of a sudden, you decided not to work with the fintech anymore, but you don't know what is actually happening with your data. And usually the data is kept. And if this fintech is bankrupted and sold to some other entity, all this data is actually moving with the same package to another entity, and you have no idea about it. And all of a sudden you get SMS welcoming you to some services. So what I'm trying to say, that it's not only about big policies. It's not about international policies also. It's also about how the local good, sometimes, laws are being implemented. For example, in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan adopted their privacy law, private data law, based on GDPR. It's a good law, but it's very technical to understand. And in majority of the cases, bureaucracies, when they read, they don't understand a thing. And they don't know what to do with this law. The same applied when we talked to the companies after that research. What it is they have to do with this law. They had to actually hire a technician who would sit with their lawyers to explain what does it mean. So what I'm trying to say that things are going both ways. When there is no demand for things as simple as to know what is happening with your privacy online, then there would be no provision of that. So there's no consumption for that. And that's why I think one of the very important things that the citizens must know and learn, not very technical stuff, but very simple things, that legal negligence does not let you be free of the cause of it. So you have to really know and you have to demand for the rights. I would also go to another layer. So even if you have internet and if you actually go to the news, what is happening with the social media specifically when you are very much dependent on the foreign sources of social media and news, especially in the, if you look at the Central Asia, particularly very little local content in local languages. Majority of the content comes in Russian language. So majority of people are still watching Russian TV, listen to Russian radio, and watching everything in Russian in majority of the cases and publications on internet in Russian language. Although Russian language is not as popular as it used to be, but it is a source of information. Well, we have the reality. Shall the national governments to think about it? But they would think about it from the perspective of control. They will do the localized content, but it would be controlled by government. And this is actually what we have a dilemma now, while local bloggers are put in the prison because they produce what they think. It's not necessarily very good quality. It doesn't have anything to do with politics. It's just because it's not controlled by the government. So they are accused in all the problems we have so far in Central Asia. I also would like to come to another important thing. Internet have been a luxury for many, many years. It was not accessible. It was mostly not accessible for countries who were very far from sea cables, subsea cables, especially Central Asia. It's a land and double landlocked. Moreover, our neighborhood, China, Afghanistan, Iran, Russia. So all the cables go through certain neighborhood where governments feel very uncomfortable to really think that internet would be provided by Chinese from China. It's no. It's impossible. None of the governments agreed. It's still on the project pipe. So everyone wants to have a Frankfurt bone, wants European internet. Why? Because there is more freedom in it. It's less filtered, and etc. So we have all these dilemmas with internet. It is still luxury in a way, but still somehow accessible. Discrimination, as I said about device, it's not accessible. Internet is very slow. And then we have also another issue, that majority of digital development in Central Asia is dependent on the technologies which are imported. It's not, Central Asia is not producing anything by itself. The technology comes, we have development. So now, all the countries who are going through digitalization, it's not even digital transformation, moving toward AI. And the second part is cryptocurrency. Why? Because energy sources, green energy, hydropower energy is there. So we have this dilemma. Do we need that much internet, or it's enough whatever we have as an economy? And it's usually what's happening now, as Trish was mentioning. It's driven by economy and economic discussion. So we need this because it will bring us more money. It's not that it's going to bring us more prosperity, we'll have more jobs. No, it's all about money. So we want to have AI because it will bring us more money. The other problem is, of course, we are talking about gender. And the problem is, again, access to internet, again, better in the urban settings, but then you go a little bit further, like 10 kilometers out of the city, usually women have no access to internet because they just don't have a device with the internet. Usually young men will have a device for internet, but they use it for Twitters or some other stuff. They don't know and they don't have digital skills to use it for the other purposes to develop. And this is actually somehow we consider as a lost on opportunities, because the internet have not been giving the opportunity for these young men to be much more exposed to opportunities to grow. And also it comes to the issue of funding. Who funds anything developed, digital development, internet, infrastructure, and etc.? There are very, very few funding. And of course, China is first with digital funding under the Road and Belt. And also, there are only few financial institutions who are coming with the financing. Unfortunately, internet is not considered to be a safe space anymore. And safe space is if the young man or young woman going to read the internet, they do not have enough critical thinking or skills to be really very selective in this ocean infobicity. Thank you.
Thank you, ZUHRA. So, I think I did mention that I'm becoming a part of the older generation, but luckily I'm still young enough to remember that this promise of what the internet could be and what it could do for humankind. And, you know, one of the big ones really being connecting humans, you know, including people in more decision-making processes. But what I've heard from you, you've said, you know, terms echo chambers, generated content, information tampering. So you've really painted a widely different internet from the one that we actually want it to be. So really the first question that comes to mind is, can we fix it? And if yes, whose responsibility is the internet? Who can and should make it better? So in 2025, as you heard from the esteemed Undersecretary, Estonia holds the chairship of the Freedom Online Coalition. So I want to also ask all of you, what are some of the avenues that these kinds of coalitions, as a group of the willing, can leverage in order to advance internet freedom? Let's start with you, Hille.
Yeah, again, I'm in a lucky position to have the Freedom House report as a base to refer to. But remember, I showed the picture of two sides, for the government to take action and for the tech providers, service providers, infra providers, content providers to take action. And it is, I think, we probably take it as a given that when we leave both sides to take their own regulations just for themselves, it won't work anymore. But there is a way to build a bridge, for example, for the governments to not sanction, not fine, not threaten, not punish, at least not at first, but to go into consultations and negotiate. How can these big tech giants who have very, like their power is probably more than a small government could ever dream of, how can they put some self-regulations in place, like content moderation? Again, we know that some of the tech giants have fired editorial teams. They're getting smaller, especially at times of electoral process. On the contrary, they could be boosted, they could be reinforced to really take care of what is going on in their own guts, and is it justified or not. And governments can be the impetus or the sort of nudge, but not demand. The editorial freedom is still of value, I think, for the platforms.
So you're saying that the onus is still quite on the tech companies themselves?
No, I think there are the sort of, not the sites, but the circles of activity. So governments, again, they can pull their strength together and go into coalitions and agree on some very fundamental principles that would then be implemented. Of course, the democratic oversight, not all the governments are good at it. And, the checks and balances must be in place. But then again, working across the silos, across the national borders, and across the sectors, like the public sector, the private providers, and then the civic activism, I think is probably the key. But I would say that the best, let's agree to leave the infra, the architecture as it is. But the best option is to go beyond this kind of technology discussions and to really put the focus on some kind of, I don't want to use the word soft, but what can be done to monitor, to safeguard, for example, safeguard encryption, which is a pretty strong way to also keep us users safe in the internet domain. And again, digital literacy, as you said, but not only, taking care that the inclusive access and inclusive sort of behavior online is possible and granted for all the groups. And this is probably what governments can initiate, but work with other actors as well.
Does anyone want to come in?
Sure. I will push back a little bit on this idea of self-regulation. I think that after 20 years of commercial internet, the market has literally failed to self-regulate itself. Instead, what we have seen is a massive concentration of power in the hands of very few companies. In the beginning of the internet, one of the properties of the internet was this idea that there were no permanent favorites, right? That every time there was a new technology that was coming in and was displacing the older one, and we were seeing that in the beginning. I am old enough to remember iMessenger and not iMessenger, sorry, Napsters and Ask Jeeves and all those crazy companies that right now nobody even talks about. But over the years, some companies became extremely sophisticated in understanding how to manipulate some of those properties of the internet and concentrate their power and actually become part of the entire stack of the internet, right? Make no mistake that currently, when you're using the internet, you're not really using the public internet, but you're going through privatized networks of either Google or Amazon and so on and so forth. So I don't think that self-regulation can actually provide the answers that we need, but collaboration, which you've also mentioned, is somewhere where we need to go back. Because with collaboration comes agency. And you've mentioned agency, and we talked about it also last night. The whole idea of the internet was this idea of agency, right? Was this idea that, yes, if you overcome the hurdle of finding a device, and as long as you had a modem somewhere, you were able to hook your computer from a garage, as the story went, and become part of the global network, and then you could create whatever you wanted. You could innovate, you can upload content, you can consume content, you could do whatever you want. But getting back this agency can only happen through this very awful term that we are using in the internet governance space called multi-stakeholder governance, which is awful, but effectively think a bunch of different people from different backgrounds, techies, civil society, the private sector, governments, academics, coming together and try to find solutions to some really complex problems. And somebody mentioned content moderation, right? Content moderation is perhaps one of the most difficult and complex things that exists out there. Currently, what we're seeing is that tech companies are really relying on AI to do all the content moderation. And this is why right now this whole hype about AI, I find it a little bit silly, because literally we've been using AI for the past 10 years to moderate content. It's just that right now it has become more popular and so on and so forth. However, it doesn't work. Purely AI does not work. You really need the civil society people, you really need human rights activists, you really need people to understand the technology, you really need the governments to impose regulation in order to figure out how to do that. And frankly, I am coming from a place where I did 180 degrees when I started in this space, long time ago. I was one of those people that were like, don't touch the internet, people, don't touch anything. You know, governments, you need to stay away. But right now, the DSA, the GDPR, the DMA, they have the potential to do something actually great. Are they doing it? No, because implementation, again, is very difficult. But there is the spirit, and you actually saw different types of organizations coming together behind the GDPR, coming together behind the DSA to try to figure out how best to do it. And because the internet is global and because the internet is complex, it will take trial and error. So as long as governments are willing to go back and review and fix, I think that we can get to a place where we actually find some solutions to some of those very complex problems.
Yeah. You mentioned the term multi-stakeholder governance. I want to delve into that a little bit more. So something I often really come across is that, you know, the average internet user has no idea really how the internet is governed or how it really works. And, you know, nor in theory should they. We care about having access. If I get to go online, well, that's good. Why do I care who owns the internet? But in the background of getting this access, you know, internet governance is actually quite multi-layered. So I'm giving you this impossible task of explaining to us in layman's terms, you know, who owns the internet? What does this have to do with multi-stakeholderism? And why would the average person care about this? What's the effect on them?
So in short, no one owns the internet, right? Going back to this whole idea of decentralized architecture. As you said, there are multiple layers to the internet. At the level of infrastructure, we're having a bunch of organizations that are responsible for performing different functions. There is an organization for managing the domain name space, that is the www.whatever.com that we're all using. There are communities that are creating the standards that support the internet communications, like the IP protocol. Then you have something that is called regional internet registries, 5 around the world that allocate those blocks of numbers that allow your ISP to get you the internet connection that you want. And all those entities are operating within their own communities, and they're operating in a bottom-up way, right? This is the multi-stakeholder model that we're referring to, the idea that no one can do this alone. And this model was supported for the past 20 years by democratic governments, and we even have a United Nations summit that sort of affirmed it, and I'm not going to go into technicalities, but what I will say is that 20 years ago, when those very hard questions were getting negotiated, mainly amongst governments, because it was happening within the United Nations, we were outside the door as civil society trying to get in. I was in Tunis, a very young student and very naive at the time, trying to get in, and we actually got in. And that's where we felt that we were part of the whole. Now it's very different. You've said something that really hit a nerve. Cables. Oh my God, if you're a landlocked country, you're literally depending on your neighbors. And if you have really bad neighbors, you do not have internet connectivity. It's as simple as that. And that's where now we are having all these geopolitics about satellite connectivity and so on and so forth. So the multi-stakeholder model, to just finish, is perhaps a democratic way of the way you see representative democracy, right? You allow people to participate and make decisions to the extent that they can. This is some sort of an analogy of the multi-stakeholder model. It is opening up participation to whoever is interested to go there and contribute based on their own experience and background as to how the internet should be governed, and then via consensus, you make decisions as the way to move forward.
I want to add on.
Yeah, so just to add, so what I hear from you is that if we want to have the internet as such as it is now, free, open, secure, it has to be multi-stakeholder governed.
Yes, and you all need to participate.
If you want to get this back, because currently it is not the situation as we witness.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, I just wanted to add on, because when we talk about the agency or multi-stakeholder group, it's all about policies, politics, you know, how it works, how the negotiation will make, who is going to be leading, etc., etc. But it's also about capacities of those societies who has these layers of multi-stakeholders. For example, in Central Asia, in majority of the cases, the governments are, if I can use that word, analog thinking people, because the age of them is analog era, but they are making decisions on the digital development, on the AI, on digital economy, on, you know, you name it. Basically, the problem is they have a very little understanding and a lot of fear. When they make any decisions, whatever stops them, that fear, because they don't know how it will turn up. And because they have this whole concept of control, of uncontrollable, which is internet, that is actually creates this whole another layer of suspicion, and then inserting, cutting internet, turning off the electricity, you name it. So the stakeholder, multi-stakeholder group is the one who actually comes to those governments, for example, and they will see, let's work together. And make that government to feel that they are also owning the process, but they also understand what everyone is talking about and why it is important. And this is basically a manual thing. In majority of the cases, when we are talking about the international level, the groups who are, like, you know, they are professional in the field, and then there are some groups coming from the countries of South who are coming and joining that effort, but they have very little leverage because they don't know what they can add on. So this is something what we think about, how to make that multi-stakeholder group inclusive, and how to make them to feel comfortable in terms of equal opportunities of input and actually sharing the concerns, because the concerns are growing, and it's not only about blocking internet. Sometimes it's about there is no electricity whatsoever. So you might have internet if you have electricity. And so the question is much more complex rather than closing the websites, etc. It's much more complex, and that's why we have to really look at the internet as a complex issue.
And I will add to that, obviously, the UN's Global Digital Compact has tried to highlight some of these issues with regard to the landlocked countries piece, and to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen at the first basic principles, i.e. access to the internet and internet infrastructure in the first place. I know through one of my affiliations, Women Leading in AI, we put into the Global Digital Compact the Alliance for Universal Digital Rights, which really focused on access to the internet being enabled for women and girls more specifically. And I'm very pleased to say that it falls within the principles under paragraph 8D, that gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls and their full, equal, meaningful participation in the digital space are essential to close the gender digital divide and advance sustainable development. And I think this is what we're getting at. Without the infrastructure, we can't do that. And so how do we then go about moving from meaningful principles and well-meaning principles on a global stage to what that means in this geopolitically tumultuous position that we find ourselves in?
Yeah.
So I would like to switch gears a little bit now. I want to talk about information. So because as I mentioned earlier, this is essentially what the internet is about. So we tend to think about information as a good thing, especially having as much information as possible. You get to make the best decisions possible. Now, it seems that the internet has seemed to turn this abundance of information into a kind of a double-edged sword. We've seen the harm this information can do to elections, democracies, but at the same time, freedom of speech is very much a core value, and we're extremely careful about limiting, especially here in Estonia because of our history. Just as an example, we're one of the few states in the EU who still don't have a hate speech law. That shows you how important freedom of speech is to us. But this is where the question of restriction of access comes in. So be it in the form of full internet shutdowns. We're talking about content moderation. So my question is, where do we actually draw the line? If and when should we limit access to information? And I actually want to hear from you, ZUHRA. Could you please share with us, because also in this panel you're the representative of the Global South, especially Central Asia. Please.
Well, apparently there were many different attempts on particularly targeting all information, or all YouTube channels and etc., which are related and connected to ISIS, and that was like a huge international campaign. It was not only about Tajikistan, but especially in the 2016, 2014. The whole concept was because majority of recruitment, as they thought that time, is happening through internet. And the messaging and narratives go through the YouTube in the local languages and etc. However, after some time when research was done, by 2018, only 1 or 2 YouTube channels were working for women with the narrative on recruitment to come to Syria, and majority of them were for men, but it was a very simple, simple recruitment. What's happening now, though? Well, ISIS is using AI, and they're using and creating the new messaging, and they're doing it in all local languages of all people who are actually, part of the ISIS. And now I don't know, with the Syrian change of the power and ISIS people coming to the power, I don't know how it's going to turn. But the problem is that, with all respect, that there was an international effort to block these particular channels. Still, it was accessible using VPN, using different other opportunities, the information was coming. So what's happening now is the same thing. The narratives are being much more sophisticated than it was before. It's in all local, on the local languages, and they keep doing the recruitment. It's again, how you are going to really moderate the content, which is almost impossible. Are you going, even you're going to block, the entire YouTube? There would be always something else coming up, and they will just say, this is our channel now, and you're going to use that. So that's another thing. As for civil society and human rights and etc., while civic spaces were shrinking, especially a few years ago, most of the civil societies moved onto the virtual civic space. So the civic space became more virtual. It was, in the beginning, not scary for the authoritarian regimes because they just didn't feel like it kind of gives any feeling that it will undermine them. But then they realized that while civil society, NGOs, groups were having a seminar, and it will have 60 people in the room, and they will talk the whole day, and it would be still the same 60 people. While moving online, now they have 6 million people at once. So that was a scale that the messaging and information or critique will go and immediately reach enormous amount of population, created that whole feeling like we have to control it and we have to stop it. So they tried. Again, there were blacklist of the websites where people should not go or should not content. So they blocked it, or they will just turn off the internet and etc. And then they realized it's not good enough. But they couldn't really create anything which would be good enough. So far, it's all limited to certain things, because in majority of the cases, people are finding the way to be connected and actually going into the sources they want to see, unless they're totally blacklisted by international, I don't know, Interpol or whatever.
Yeah, so before we turn to audience questions, I have this last question. I want to start it with a quote by the creator of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee. So he said, "The web as I envisaged it, we have not seen it yet. The future is still so much bigger than the past." So what will the future of internet look like? What should it look like? Tricia, I want to start with you, with your view on this, especially, taking into account, emerging tech, AI, please.
Yeah, so it's a really big question. What will the future of the internet look like? And on the one hand, you could say, actually, it could be full of so much more content. Mm-hmm. We're going to have like an utter information overload. I mean, the amount of information, according to Statista, as at the end of 2024, we already create 2.99 billion minutes of recorded Microsoft Teams within a minute. We send 2.511 billion emails within a minute. We send 3.3 million snaps shared on Snapchat. We send 1.389 billion reels played on Facebook and Instagram, also within that self-same minute. And somewhat less tweets now, thank goodness. 347,200 tweets on X. And I think that just gives you the scale of the problem we have now. That's exponential growth of information, even in the last couple of years, since some of the last statistics of 2022 that I'd seen. And the challenge with that is, who is generating this information, or dare I say, what is generating this information or informative content? So could the future of the internet on a more dystopian side be actually not content generated by a human at all? Is it content going to be mediated by generative AI? So that's my kind of first question to the future of the internet. Will this internet have content at all that is worthy of looking at? But on the kind of second side of that, we need this internet, I believe, to communicate as a global world. I think there is hope. There is hope through the Internet Governance Forum, please. And
if it survives.
The Global Digital Compact there as well, to try and really fulfill some of the aims of what this was supposed to do, and to not only democratize it, but to equally distribute it. So my hope is that some of the principles, some of the objectives we're seeing out of that Global Digital Compact that was only very recently agreed in 2024, that we might see a future hope of a better internet, that one that doesn't delist people, that doesn't blacklist people, that doesn't shadow ban the users themselves and not just the content in all that information moderation, or close down countries-wide internet in some instances, but one that actually we work globally together. But I'm going to defer to Konstantinos, who is much more expert in this area than I.
Konstantinos is already in his chair, I need to come up.
Yeah, I'm just trying really to be positive here, but I really think that things are going to get worse before they get any better. I appreciate the information overload, but I think that currently it's much more than that. Very soon, countries will be asked to make a choice, what sort of internet they want. Yes. And that choice will be between a somewhat open, global, and interoperable internet, because the internet is not fully open or global or interoperable, but it never was, right? I mean, even in the early days. Or an internet that China currently promotes that is very much state-centric. And we are seeing that choice being given to countries even now, right? I mean, in the context of trade, you've mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. We know that China, through bilateral agreements with all the countries that are signing up, they're signing up also to some very specific digital policies, and countries, especially in the global South and Africa, and are emulating a lot of Chinese laws. So the internet will become less open. It will become less a place for human rights and empowerment, for sure, at least in the short term. But I still believe in the technology, and I still believe in this idea that the infrastructure will facilitate at some point people to come back together. The one thing that, and it goes back also to your previous question, governments have a massive responsibility to start education early on about information. What is the internet? How to use the internet? I believe that it's Finland that has inserted in their curriculum a disinformation, misinformation, and they saw literally a huge drop domestically in the way people understand and consume content and how they reject misinformation. There are no magic wands here. You cannot just snap your fingers and suddenly everything will get fixed, which is what we're seeing currently a lot of democratic countries wanting to do. We see laws that want to ban social media use. What you're doing is actually encouraging people to go underground and use VPNs in order to access them. You are not going to fix that by creating those massive, all-inclusive bans. You really need to start working, I believe, and educate people. Again, someone mentioned education in this conversation about what the internet is and how to use it. And please, all of you, engage as much as you want, as you can.
Yeah, it looks like time for audience questions. So, a raise of hands. So everybody knows what the internet is. That's good.
Either that or it was too complicated.
That's indeed a possibility. But
can I add a point, actually? What's really interesting is we're talking about the governance of the internet, but actually, where's the individual redress?
Yeah.
We might have our human rights affected by access or no access, being landlocked or otherwise, being discriminated on grounds of gender or all manner of other human rights. But actually, there's very little redress there, and redress mechanisms, certainly not direct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's also just a simple thing about data, which is very important to think. And in only 2018, it was the amount of data collected was more than 5,000 years of data collection, only in 1 year. And in majority of the cases, people using only 0.5% of this data.
Yeah.
So the collection of the data is huge. The question is, what will happen with this data? How it's going to come and implicate in all these scary things we were talking yesterday about Elon Musk, accessing social security, et cetera, It's all about data. And so he will actually own that much data if he will be allowed to, and how he's going to use it, where it will end up. So it is a scary thing. But as you said, people should start taking care of themselves. They have to start asking difficult questions and taking care of their own children to see what's happening with them. And unless they will start doing it themselves and demanding for more, there would be no supply.
So do I understand correctly that you're saying that we have to ask the question of how the people actually themselves can benefit from the fact that their data is being used to generate profit?
Yeah, exactly.
Or to hold them to account when they're actually making that data available and saying, don't make that data available. I was going to add to that point that actually, for a generative AI model, at the model basis, it only needs to use that data once.
Yeah.
That's for training it, for verifying it and validating it, and then boom, it's gone. That data is no longer useful.
That's good.
Do we have questions?
No questions?
So let's then, if no questions, I actually wanted to...
Oh, we have a question at the back.
Yeah, please.
On see siis Jako Kull Eesti Kultuurikoda.
Estonian Chamber of Culture. Estonian Chamber of Culture, so I'm here at the very back. I have a question. So I hope you have all your headphones. So basically, this is a summary of 3 panels, because first panel I had a question, but I wanted to say something, but now I have 4 things I recall. Random order. So we have had 2 panels which concern this topic, that human society lives in a cyclical world. We need to remind this to ourselves more often, that this is not anything new. Things have happened before. It will be happening in the future. Whether Trump happened, we knew this is going to happen if you actually look into it. So this is a political question. So all the geographic issues, mental issues, they tend to be cyclical. Then second thing is that we talk about the war. In a Christian word, I apologize, I got to come to the early Bible. There's always war. Cain and Abel, there was a war, and war is still ongoing. Now, as a comment, coming to internet, I hope you don't mind, I would say this is also a type of a war, because you talked about data. We hand over our own data. So this is the soft war. Then I wanted to say 2 more things. That all these things we've been covering today, then everybody has to come up with themselves of what is going to happen to us after we die. So it doesn't really matter what we say here, but we want to make sure that war is not going to happen. And then third point, I've said a few times over the last few years that yes, indeed, we talk about human rights, but if we're not talking at the same time human obligations, although somebody from Ukraine once mentioned it, and if we're not talking about justice, you know what I mean, then there is no hope that anything would actually improve. So who are the we? These are not governments or states. These are people. So it's very important the words we use. It's not businesses which are creating anything. People create things. Governments will establish. So it's not governments who establish anything. People are establishing themselves. So I'm sorry if I said something which you didn't consider important, but all the best.
So who wants to take that one?
That was a rhetoric, I think.
But I think that, you know, it raises also a point that I wanted to make also earlier on, that we have the tendency to believe, especially in the context of the internet, that we can apply technical fixes to address societal problems. Mm-hmm. And I don't understand when this came about, but this frankly, it's pretty stupid, right? I mean, misinformation and disinformation existed before the internet. Hate speech existed before the internet. All of those nasty things, child pornography existed before the internet. What the internet has done, and that is a game changer, and I accept that, is that it has scaled those things, right? Right now, you know, you have someone who spreads disinformation in Canada, and someone in New Zealand will take that and will circulate it, and then it just goes global. But beyond that, these are human behaviors. These are societal problems. And unless societies come together and try to figure them out, we are not going to fix them by passing laws in the internet or doubling down on the internet and trying to use technologies, whether it's AI or other very scary things, in order to be able and address those things. I was just reading earlier this morning that the UK government demanded Apple to break encryption in order to be able and get access to catch criminals. This is where we are. This is the state that we are. We are using technology, and governments are using, some governments are using technology because it is easier to control some of those things. How were they catching criminals before the internet? You know, they were doing thorough investigations. Now, this seems to be like outwardly simply because it's so much easier to get the data and so much easier to pinpoint down and go and arrest people. So it goes back to really education. It really goes back to what sort of an internet you want and what sort of a society you're operating. You want that internet to operate within.
Yeah, very good conclusion.
This very much goes into what Tricia said as well, as technology and internet as tools, as power tools, and who operates the tools is the people.
It's not only about operation, but I think let's not mix up control and governing or governance. So that's why we're talking about multi-stakeholderism and what are the right, respecting, but sensible ways to make governance actually happen and to produce some impact that we are looking for. Because if we keep talking about control, then we end up with this kind of sovereign internets, the way China has already reached this kind of limits, really, of the kind of freedom and action online and in the digital space. So let's not try to mess this up. It is possible to govern this tool and these platforms, but we must really find a very smart way to do that.
But I think there's 2 points on that as well. That one is about participatory governance and recognising and really including that conversation from the very citizens and users who are going to be using it as well. But I think as an enabling environment for that is we've got to have a proper open societal discussion. What kind of internet do we want? What kind of tools do we want? What kind of society do we want? What are the values on which that society is based? Because we're the ones, and like was mentioned earlier on, the companies are made up of people and people who have values and bring the values to the table. And I think there's been a global loss of moral compass, for want of a better word. I think, in fact, in a lot of my conversations which I have with companies about responsible AI, they lack the ethics language. What's a virtue? What's a Kantian duty? All of these moral kind of values that we want to bring, and ethical values that we want to bring to the table to help secure human rights, help secure an inclusive and diverse future and sustainable future. We've got to be having a societal discussion and then help people be participatory, because I think people have lost trust. They've lost trust in governmental organisations. They've lost trust in governments, as we heard earlier on, and they've certainly started to lose trust in tech companies.
And 2 sentences.
Just very basic thing. Thank you very much. I think it's important to mention it's all human behavior. And one very important thing about China. China produces technology they bring to these countries, give it to them. These countries do not have money. They just take it as a gift. After some time, the technology is old. It needs maintenance or a replacement. Then China says, Huawei, for example, say you have to pay for it. And there is no money. So what's happening with the surveillance cameras? They are not going to be changed. So this data will never happen, and etc. So what I'm trying to say, it's not ideal as we think. Things are done by human as human usually does. They will start good, and then they will just do whatever as usual.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And just as final words, I want to say that to make a full circle and come to this dystopia theme, to me it sounds as if there's a scales in front of us to which we're always running, we will never reach. And on the scales, there's dystopia and utopia. And right now, it's very much weighing towards dystopia. And I guess the internet, at this point, is on this dystopia scale. Let's try and bring it back to the utopia scale.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Good luck.